midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I'm the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm excited to welcome our next guest onto our interview series, Cat Hernandez. She is the partner and founding team member of The Venture Collective. Cat, thank you for being here. If you want to start off by sharing a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns and when you were younger. Do you remember how exactly you answered the question? What do you want to be when you grow up?
Well, first, thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of what AllVoice stands for and am super excited to be here. So just in terms of background, I grew up in the Middle East, was an expat kid my whole life, and found my way through boarding school and eventually college in the Midwest and postgraduate in New York. And so I've actually lived in New York City for the better part of 12, 13 years now, which feels like an absolute lifetime. But as a kid, having come from a traditional Filipino American family, there were like kind of like two traditional paths that you could take. You could become a doctor or you could become a lawyer. Secondary to that, you could become a nurse, which a lot of Filipino professionals eventually become. But that was really it. Like there wasn't really kind of a more expanded view of what could you be when you grew up, because so much of being a first-gen immigrant and having the good fortune that I have was centered around using that education for professions that I think my parents just like, they understood to be the highest bar of performance at the time.
I love that, fellow New Yorker. And I think that our foundation really kind of impacts how we show up every day and who we are as well. Is there anything else that you would say before we jump into kind of more work-related questions? What else defines you as a person, Kat?
Well, so my upbringing defines me a lot, as it does, I think, for a lot of people. And this is why I believe so much in the democratization of access to, a variety of different things, because part of the challenge is exposure. And, secondary to that is being able to afford certain things. So whether that is education or healthcare or things within finance, like those are the things that ground me every single day, because I think the reality is that if I was not born to the right person in my family, I would not have had the good fortune that I did. And part of it is luck and part of it is an insane amount of work. But I think that definitely grounds me as an investor today. It grounded me as an operator, a decade ago when I used to run people and ops teams for an extensive period of time.
Yeah, I mean, being an investor and also being an operator, really impacting people's dreams and day to day too. And I definitely want to ask, in relation to your work with the Venture Collective too, what are some kind of examples of key milestones for some portfolio companies, for folks who aren't really familiar with the path as well?
Yeah, so listen, I think one of the biggest things about the world of tech is this belief and knowledge that it is quite homogenous, particularly as it relates to folks who end up rising to the top or taking the most senior positions at companies. And the reality is that that kind of change takes time. It takes a lot of different companies hiring in the right ways, retaining in the right ways, promoting in the right ways in order to really drive that change. And I think, like, fundamentally, as an early stage investor, one of the biggest things that you can do, or one of the biggest areas you can drive impact, is by delivering dollars to the right places, right? So by supporting more underrepresented groups, founders that look more like me and you, like, I think that that actually is probably the fastest way to drive change, because those same people will end up building diverse teams and it will not be a challenge for them to do so. The secondary side of things, because we take a much more inclusive view of the way that we invest, is like, at the end of the day, we want to investing in mission-driven founders who also just want to drive impact in the right places and who are allies if they are not underrepresented themselves. And so when I think about milestones, there's a couple of different things. Like, tactically, you need to make sure that you're giving out equity in the right way from the beginning. The reality is, and maybe this is a unfavorable point of view, is that 20% of your team really early on, especially, is going to drive 80% of the productivity of your business. And so if you think about it from that respect, then you're very careful about how you divvy out equity. But it also means that more people have a much more kind of significant stake in the business early on. And that's really what changes people's lives, right? If you own a point or 2 or 3 points of a business when they're worth, only a few $1,000,000, at the point that there's any reasonable outcome, that really makes a substantial difference versus the other point of view, which is you give out a tiny bit of equity to everyone. And I would argue, because value and impact is not delivered equally, that can be very challenging, right? And unless you're like an expert at the kind of art of giving out equity, I think that a lot of founders struggle with that in the really early days. So getting good counsel on how they do that is really, really important. The other thing is, from a team milestones perspectives, because we take this more kind of inclusive view of we want to help as many people rise as possible, the expectation of our founding teams is that they are as diverse as possible from the very beginning. So if the founders themselves are not diverse, or they happen to be part of the majority of what the tech ecosystem looks like, then there has to be a commitment around looking at what the next set of 10 hires looks like and making a concerted effort to diversify those pipelines, to make actual hires that don't look like them or don't come from the same demographic backgrounds. And I think all you can really do is be very intentional in that regard. And I have a lot of sympathy for companies in the really early days, because there's a lot to get done and there's a lot of pressure to do that very quickly. And so sometimes the work around DEI is in the back burner. But I think if you make it consistent from the beginning, it becomes a lot less cumbersome as the business evolves and as it grows.
Now, absolutely. Investing in mission-driven companies is really important, and thinking about these early decisions around equity also impacts the business for years to come too. I think the stat you shared was, what was it? So for early stage startups, 20% of your team is impacting 80% of the business. Is that right?
I think that's a personal belief, and I think there's actually some research to back that. I think because, well, I guess my view of the world as a former people leader is that talent is not created equally. Impact is certainly not delivered equally. And in the really early days, you don't have a ton of infrastructure to support employees in the same way as like really big corporations do, right? And I would argue that very different subset of people go to work in the truly chaotic environment of pre-seed and seed stage companies versus those that join as the businesses evolve and really grow. So I think it's more just really thinking through, if I have a 10% option pool, if I'm going to make 5 key hires this year, how can I be super intentional about that? How can I not be reactive to those open positions? How can I ensure that I'm going well beyond my network to get a more rounded point of view? And I think everyone can agree that, especially in building products that serve a large majority of people, having a wide perspective, period, is better than having a singular perspective.
Absolutely.
So that it's not just about equity, it's about cash as well. And it's about making sure people feel empowered. But most employees that join really early companies are making huge sacrifices to do so, right? And that means that their level of motivation is probably different than the person that goes to work in a large Fortune 1000 company in a singular role where they own a very tiny set of like objectives relative to the entire organization. In the environments where we fund, it's survival of the fittest. It's this like race to product market fit so that they don't run out of money before they can serve the kinds of customers that they want to be serving.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I definitely agree with you that intentionality, being proactive instead of reactive, it's not just a nice to have, it's better for the business. And there's a bunch of research out there to support it. In terms of building out that initial team, I definitely want to ask your opinion about the intentionality behind job referrals. I think in a lot of early stage places, you kind of go to people who are in your network, who went to the same schools, who had the same privileges you did. Are they effective, and can they be effective if thought about in the right way?
Yeah, I guess it depends what your base is, right? Like if the base of your team is diverse, then like seeking referrals is a great way to kind of direct high quality hiring from the get go. There's the dangers of always just humans in general tend to go with what they're comfortable with, right? This is not a problem just for like folks that are not diverse. This is a human condition that exists. So part of it is just being very self-aware of that, especially if you as a founder or an early executive at a startup have never hired a lot of people in your lifetime, right? Like it is a muscle that you need to keep working on in order to really do it well. And so I think and you've seen this transition, right? More early stage companies are hiring people leaders earlier and faster than ever before, because there is such an insane amount of focus around humans and the fact that people really are your only asset early on until you have something like proprietary and defensible that you can sell more broadly. So I think referrals are dangerous in that if you never look outside of that, if you never apply structure to the way that you hire, if you never think about the lack of diversity on your team, then that problem will perpetuate forward. I do think that in general, referrals tend to be a more loyal employee base, at least for like the midterm, because there's this I guess like perspective that I'm sure also is backed by research, which is like if people have friends where they work or have like a personal affinity towards somebody at their company, there's a much higher likelihood that they stay at those companies, right? Because at the end of the day, humans want to connect with each other, and that commonality is very valuable. The reason why most people don't stay is like at some point they don't get value in certain areas, right? Whether that is compensation or in their role or out of their manager, or they're not seeing like the upward mobility that they need to see. The rubber hits the road at some point, so it's only so effective. But there's plenty of value in designing a thoughtful referral program that actually gets you closer and closer to hitting the parity or the equality that you want in your employee base. But as with most things that are related to people, it takes a lot of work.
Absolutely. It takes a lot of work. It's not a black and white answer. You have to look at your foundation, look at your goals, and again, be really strategic around why you are looking at referrals too. I mean, you mentioned that executives might not have experience hiring teams, hiring a lot of people, and I think that definitely makes sense and speaks to some experiences that I've heard from others as well in terms of kind of that equity driven executive too. From your experience, how can someone intentionally train executives to build their processes to be more equitable, have that empathy, think about these hard and soft skills that are necessary to lead and motivate, empower a team?
Yes. The first thing that I would do is like, you've got to plan ahead, right? The worst thing that you can do as a hiring manager is only hire when you're like 10 steps behind, which is basically what every startup does, which is why they end up in the place that they do. So I think that if you have the opportunity to look forward on these are the milestones that we need to hit as a business, these are the gaps that we have within our existing teams, this is where we can make some accommodations in terms of seniority or like very specific expertise. Like that's step one, right? Step one is actually just being proactive, period. Step two is utilizing technology. I think there's plenty of software in this world that has been designed to help you reduce subjectivity and bias during the hiring process, improve the top of funnel so that it's not the same people every single time. And for really large corporations, there's even technology that helps them filter through those thousands of applicants to get to some subset of them that are more skill centric rather than like, where did you go to school and like, what was your previous job. My co-founder or the founding partner of my firm, Nick, actually built a YC-backed business that was solely focused on reducing subjectivity in the hiring process by applying an insane amount of software and data science engineering behind it. And there's plenty of versions of these startups that exist. I think the question for you as an early stage company is like, what can you cobble together that gives you a more comprehensive view of how you approach hiring? And then the other side of it, because it's an ongoing thing, is training. It's a wildly underutilized thing in the early days, especially because it's often seen as just like, oh, like it's kind of a waste of money. But I do think that there's a psychology around how you engage with humans. There's a inherent bias that we all bring to the table, that if you are not training people around how to think around that, then you will run into issues with how you interview people, how you extend offers to them, how you compare, one candidate versus the other. And that can be very dangerous, right? So you can have the most sophisticated process in the world, but then at the end of the day, when you deliberate, it's still basically based on personal opinion and experiences. So those would be kind of the three different areas that I think companies, in the early days can set some light foundations. And what I'm not suggesting like having an insanely complicated system here, but I think you can probably agree most early stage companies have no system at all. And so somewhere in the middle where there's a bit of method to the madness, I think is the happy medium. And then as you build a people team, obviously that gets refined further and further as the business and the culture evolve.
I mean, you mentioned that in terms of building a people team for early stage kind of startups and organizations, people are doing it kind of earlier and earlier. I know there's probably not a threshold that you would say you need a people person at this point, but I've heard of organizations literally growing, hundreds of people and they still don't have their first hire. Are there questions that, organizations should ask themselves, whether they're executives or other kind of team members, to say, okay, at this point, we definitely need someone who is a full-time people or talent person that you would recommend?
Yes. So I guess I look at HR and recruiting or people operations and like kind of recruiting differently. So if you're growing a lot and you're taking in like large amounts of capital with the expectation that a lot of that capital is going to go towards hiring, then it probably makes sense to hire one, if not two recruiters, depending on the breakdown of those roles, right? And founders and founding teams have an insane amount of responsibility to be drivers of hiring early on, right? It doesn't matter if there's somebody there helping you kind of maneuver through the process. The reality is that like in the really, really early days of company building, people come there to work for those people, and they need to be seen as integral parts of company building and culture building. Otherwise, it kind of, why not just work for somewhere else where like you can get paid very well and not have to make those kinds of sacrifices if that's something that you have to make. On the people operations side of things, or more HR driven side of things, like I do think that once you get to be beyond like 100 employees, it's not possible anymore to know everybody's birthday, to remember like, and many of the things that you were doing up to 100 employees, they stop scaling, right? So at my last company that I operated at in 2012, which feels I operated from 2012 to 2015 at this last company. And, one of the things that we did was to do kind of socials for every person that we brought on board, because we wanted them to have some kind of experience beyond the interview panel that they had, and give other people across the company a chance to experience somebody that they may interact with on a daily basis. And our CEO also used to do new hire dinners like in his home, like every single month. And after a while, you're like, that's a lot of people. And it doesn't scale. But in the really early days, it was such a fun and intimate thing to be doing. But there's this the way that I look at the world of HR is like your job is to kind of create the infrastructure and programs that allow people to really be their best selves on a daily basis and perform at like 100%. And there has to be a person or a set of people that are responsible for that. It doesn't just manifest itself, even in the most thoughtful of founders.
Yeah, exactly. You can care a lot, but if you don't do anything about it, who is that really helping at the end of the day? I do want to talk about kind of operationalizing kind of equity too. I know we talked about the candidate experience and hiring, people teams, and equity itself as well. And you work with a ton of organizations. What are kind of some of the most exciting as you've seen portfolio companies make or implement in leveling the playing field for historically underrepresented groups like women, people of color, and first generation kind of employees that you kind of haven't seen before in your experience?
And is this just as it relates to equity or just in general?
It could just be in general.
Um, I don't know that it's not anything that I've ever seen before, because I do think that while Silicon Valley and like, the coast get a bad rap for not having the most diverse teams, like there are diverse people that have been thriving in these ecosystems for a long time. So like I think the thing that I've noticed is not a single thing. It's more that there's such an insane focus on it, right? That it's no longer seen as this like nice to have, right? It used to be, and like diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a new topic. This is something that people have known about and discussed for like many, many, many decades. But I do think that in the last 2 to 3 years, because of the like changes within our culture, because of also the increasing stake that Gen Z has and that millennials have in the workforce, there is a seismic shift in the way that people prioritize where your internal dollars go, right? And you can see that most clearly actually in the way that companies are approaching employee benefits. It used to be like your baseline benefit was like a gym membership and like some healthcare,
Yep.
maybe a 401k. But I do think that like in the last, couple of years, especially, there's been a lot of focus on things like family leave, on disability, on much more flexible work environments. There's a lot more fintech and HR tech like startups that are trying to help the everyday American save better for retirement, because we can no longer rely on 401ks in the same way that we could in the past. So the burden for employers is quite high in this country because we don't have the same government subsidies as
Right.
like the European nation. So it is partly why it feels sometimes that like it's so hard for businesses that sell to employers to succeed, because those same buyers are getting inundated with like hundreds, if not thousands, of different products on an annual basis. And so, how do you actually prioritize what will be valuable to the highest subset of your employees? Because there's not really a great way to customize benefits on an individual basis, right? You're still having to do it in aggregate to a certain extent because it's nearly impossible to truly personalize. So I think that those little changes, they make it more possible for working moms. They
Right.
make it possible for people who have two jobs. They like, and none of these things are frowned upon in the way that they used to be frowned upon.
Mhm.
So that coupled with the cultural acceptance is amazing.
Right.
And it allows people to have a little bit more control about how they drive their livelihoods, which I think for a lot of people, like they never really feel like they have, right? Especially if they're in junior or mid-level positions at large companies. Doesn't have to be tech companies, even just companies in general.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm really excited to see all of the family forming benefits, the real mental health benefits as well, giving people more time and company-wide days to really spend time with their family, friends, or do whatever is important to them in their lives at this specific point. In terms of kind of hyper growth companies, people are at different points of their career, different points of their lives, and when you're making changes, when you're growing, people always have feedback, whether it's positive, negative, and how do you see kind of employee feedback management as an important tool to really continually to proactively build a culture of listening at these successful organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, right? Because in life, it's important. Like you're not, and because companies are living, breathing entities, right? So as you change your employee base, like the dynamics within your company change. So it's unreasonable to believe that whatever you've instituted 10 years ago is going to continue to be effective, today. And
Yeah,
so I do think that natural evolution is important, and getting feedback from employees, whether that's positive or negative, is valuable. The challenge will be just making sure you have the right context, right? Similarly, like, when you're thinking about being a consumer for an e-commerce brand, for instance, like it's very easy it's very motivating to complain about when something goes wrong with something that you buy. It's very rare that you go and you celebrate something fantastic that happens with a brand. And so I think actually the same psychology applies within companies. It's very easy to take for granted the things that you either don't see or that you don't think are that valuable or you think are a baseline for employers to provide, but actually take a lot of work to implement and implement well. It's very easy to complain about being passed up for a promotion, being, not getting this, the equity or the cash that you were looking for, not being able to, manage a team or whatever it is that kind of impacts your day to day. I think there's a responsibility on both ends to make sure that we're being very constructive about the way that we engage, because a lot of decisions get made from that.
right.
And when you're talking about hundreds or thousands of people, those are important and valuable perspectives that I never take for granted. Like you want to listen and you want to have the right pulse, but you also need to recognize that it's very hard to make every single person happy. It's almost nearly impossible. So what can you do to ensure that you're doing, slightly more than enough? Because I don't think anything will ever be enough.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about that two-way conversation as well, providing context on both ends. And, not everything can happen tomorrow, but just acknowledging that you hear someone, you kind of understand where they're coming from as well. It's part of that. And you're right, we get feedback in different parts of our lives all the time. So just like an organization, it's important to get it there too. I know I asked really kind of specific questions about your experience and just what you've seen work really well, but if you were to pick a top of mind current state, what's the next problem you're trying to solve, Kat?
Um, Unfortunately, the problem I'm going to continue to solve is the same problem that I'm probably going to solve for the next decade, is like, how do we direct more capital to go into the right hands so that it can have this like trickle down effect on the world, starting in the world of tech, because, that's kind of where we operate. And changes like that just take a long time. Right. And, frankly, I think if we are successful, if other underrepresented managers are successful, you will see a very different proliferation of successful startups over the course of the next decade. And that will hopefully translate into a very different, also and diverse subset of people becoming financially successful and having that optionality that I would say, like, that's not something that a lot of like first gen immigrants or underrepresented people look like they can achieve, right? And I think when you make that possible for as many people as you can, you start to really change things. And if I can drive the dollars that are given to us by LPs, my hope is that at some point LPs also really think about that potential and impact in a very different way, because it really is like it will be the reason why things get better. And money is the single fastest way that we can drive that change. It has such an insane impact on everything. And so for me, the consistency around investing in mission driven founders who want to build inclusive and diverse work environments, that's going to be the work of a lifetime. whether that's work as a, investor, as an LP, as an operator, like it basically translates into everything that I do and every organization that I choose to be a part of. It's such a big job that it requires so many of us to do it for a long time and to persevere, even if it is difficult.
Absolutely. The economic independence, the economic kind of support there, really investing in mission-driven founders is really important. I do want to ask, I know we are nearing the end of our conversation, but we are in February 2022, which is in the United States, Black History Month. I want to ask, I've seen some companies invest with their dollars by saying, for employees, you can choose whatever organization you want, and we will invest our dollars in there. We will also host events, programming. What have you seen for either portfolio companies or out in the world be really kind of impactful and authentic and intentional in celebrating and honoring Black History Month?
I think we were talking about this a little bit earlier. Like, I think the most interesting ways of elevating these voices and perspectives is when you can make it core to your business, right? And I think actually Peloton is probably a business that has done it quite well, both in the diversity of their instructors, but in the way that they create content and integrate very timely things into what is proliferated through their community. And because they've normalized that, and other brands do this as well, but it's top of mind because I feel like every ride is a thematic ride, which is great. But it's that kind of like, if you can make it just part of the way that you exist as a business, there's an amazing amount of value there, because for your employees, they feel that, right? They don't feel it as like, oh, it happens to be X month, so we're going to do Y. And I think Chief is actually a great example of that as well, right? The consistency in the content and the exposure that they give the members, and the quality of the experiences is what drives people to feel that connectivity. And I'm sure for the Chief employee base, like, it's part of what makes them like super excited to continue doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
And so that is, I think, the thing that every startup should find their version of. Maybe slightly harder if you're selling like a B2B CRM or analytics software, but I think there's a way that you can do it subtly, right? And you can see Google does this, like even just in the way that they change their logo to commemorate certain things happening in the world. It's very small, it's very subtle, but people notice it. And it starts then to spark conversation, which that is conversation that frankly did not happen like not that long ago. Mm-hmm. So that is, I think, those are some really good examples of businesses and efforts that feel more authentic and less a side effect of the fact that it happens to be a certain, type of month that we're celebrating.
I love that. Make it into the business, be consistent, be proactive, and think about kind of the why behind it too. I think that goes back to our context conversation as well. Kat, is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to share with people listening, or underscore one or two key takeaways you hope people bring with them?
Oh man, I'm not one to like put a fine point on anything and sound like extra authoritative, but I think the one thing that I would say is, like, as an investor now, I have such respect for founders and operators who every single day they come to work, they do a great job, they aspire to do better. And I think it's perfectly okay for each of you to ask more of the companies that you work for, because working is such a large percentage of our existence, but it also doesn't have to be the entirety of your existence. So that balance is incredibly important. I've always found to be very important in the way that you show up every single day. And so if I have anything to share, it's just that, for me this year, if I had any goal, it would be to find some balance in the way that I do things, and to prioritize like high value activities more so than like large volume activities.
Yeah.
But that is a tough thing to do in a society that values like the amount. that you do. Exactly.
Yes, I love your also call to action of ask for more. You should ask for more. I appreciate that.
I think women especially tend
Yeah.
to not do that. And so it's such a valuable thing to know how to ask for it well too, right? So it's not just like pounding the table, but it's about finding a thoughtful way to have other people see your perspective. And that is one of the hardest things that I think every single person has to learn. And if they don't learn it, very few of them like end up rising to like really senior or like wide impact positions, because it's not just about having a definitive point of view, it's about helping other people believe it and see it. Otherwise, like, you're on an island on your own for a very long time, and that just seems lonely and unnecessary.
Yes, absolutely. We're in it together. And the way to learn it is to practice again, and continue building that skill. Kat, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great rest of your day, and I hope your listeners take away one or two good nuggets from today's conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And as a reminder for folks who are listening at AllVoices, we really believe in that employee feedback management as a requirement for the organization to succeed overall. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.